Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. There's a fair bit of stuff going on the international scene, so I'll start with that. And I refer in particular to the continuing alarming and erratic behaviour of the new Trump administration, which within days was talking about variously acquiring Greenland, the Panama Canal and Canada. And the latest development seems to be that Ukraine is in real trouble now, and it's entirely possible that Trump and Russia's President Putin have done some sort of deal, or they're getting close to one without Ukraine being involved. None of us have any idea what these conversations have consisted of, but it's hard to imagine that it's anything good. And this should matter to all Australians, because if Russia is allowed to win, that sends the signal to other aggressors, most importantly in our region, President Xi of China, that military aggression and seizing territory is okay with the Trump administration. And for those people who think that Ukraine is too far away to worry about, I'll pose a couple of simple questions. Do you like the world that we are currently living in, as imperfect as it is? Or would you prefer one dominated by authoritarian nations such as China, Russia, North Korea and Iran? One of the strange things about the modern Republican Party in the United States, I'm reliably informed by analysts over there, about 50% of MAGA Republicans think that Putin is an admirable figure and that he and other authoritarians, such as Hungary's Viktor Orban, should be imitated. It's as if Republican foreign policy is being written by Tucker Carlson. Now, I don't know about you, but I've become quite attached to our little democracy and quaint features such as the rule of law, fairly free speech, and a bit of social justice. Which, by the way, when I look at what's going on in the US at the moment, it makes me wonder, what are all of our shared values that we're always being told about? I'm struggling a bit at this point to certainly see what they might be. They certainly don't seem to be things such as a belief in free and fair elections. But getting back to Australia and our security, the situation is a bit more serious than some, empty words and threats from the United States. Many US allies are being hit with tariffs for no particular reason, and that includes Australia, our steel and aluminium. The mainstream media spent a few days obsessing about whether or not we will receive an exemption. We probably won't, and completely overlooked the symbolism of what is happening. The economic consequences of a 25% tariff are actually fairly minimal, as Australia only exports about $700 million worth of steel and $300 million worth of aluminium to the US. But what counts is that the alliance, AUKUS, all of these things seems to count for nothing. The US has already pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords for the second time, as well as the World Health Organization. NATO is back on the chopping block. It's been known for some time that that's privately been on Donald Trump's mind. The performances of both Vice President Vance and Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth at the Munich Security Conference were stunningly bad, with the former saying the greatest threat to Europe was from, quote, the enemy within, which is absolute palpable rubbish, and the latter giving away the negotiating position of the US to Russia by already saying Ukraine won't be admitted to NATO and all of the conquered territories can remain under Moscow's control. Now, it's not as if we haven't been warned, including by people like me. Numerous analysts have been saying for years that Australia is far too dependent on the US and the ADF must be more robust and we need a much larger industry base to support the concept of semi-independent operations. We sat back and watched the first Trump administration behave erratically. Then we suffered through COVID and the disruption of international supply chains. There was a bit of reactive stuff, but we haven't done anything particularly important to strengthen self-reliance. For far too long, politicians on both sides of politics have been complacent, as has all of the defence establishment. And even now, all that Defence Minister Richard Marles can do is repeat over and over again stuff about the international rules-based order when it is apparent to just about everyone, apart from him it would seem, that the US is no longer interested in any rules. What sort of ally threatens to seize the territory of another sovereign nation in the form of Denmark just because it wants to? And as I think I remarked in a previous podcast, how is this in any way different from China's President Xi threatening to take control of Taiwan? At the moment, the only idea the current government appears to have is to wait for 4 years and hope that the next US president will return to the good old days of cooperation and predictability, and that nothing will go wrong in the meantime. Now, that's a very poor bet, and it's the policy equivalent of putting your fingers in your ears and humming loudly. The next president may well be Trump. You know, he could be elected for a third term. There are any number of ways around the constitutional limit of 2 terms. For example, he could simply run as the vice president to someone else. The other person, a Republican, gets elected and then resigns 30 seconds after being sworn in. So that would give Trump another 4 years. And by the way, these sorts of scenarios are not at all unlikely. Again, people in the United States tell me that these sorts of scenarios, these sorts of projections are being actively gamed out. And the problem for Australia is that while there are some ways of rapidly increasing the effectiveness of the ADF, they all cost money, and in some cases quite a lot of it. Strangely, even though both Labor and the Coalition keep repeating the line that Australia's strategic circumstances are the worst since the Second World War because of China's military strength, they seem both equally reluctant to actually do anything about it. Because of the long lead times needed for many complex military systems, typically about 5 years for a ship or an aircraft, it's impossible to strengthen all of the ADF overnight, but there are some things that could be done fairly quickly. Because of the large sea gap around Australia, I'm in favour of more F-35s and more KC-30A aerial tankers. And another idea would be to retire RAF's ageing Hawk trainer fleet and replace them with modern light attack aircraft, such as the FA-50 from Korea Aerospace Industries. It's basically a small F-16 packed with a lot of electronics and can carry a lot of weapons, and double the number of those required. So those things combined would give the Air Force a big boost. The biggest problem, I think, is lack of naval assets. Now, it's still not too late to take Lursen up on the offer of morphing construction of Arafura OPVs into heavily armed corvettes, similar to ones being built for Bulgaria. I know I've said it before. I'll say it one more time. And why this offer has been overlooked repeatedly by defence planners, for me, is one of the abiding mysteries of the age. Now, I've been to Bulgaria. They're being constructed in Varna on the Black Sea coast. I've seen a lot of warships, and I can assure you that they are powerful, cost-effective packages. If the idea had been implemented a couple of years ago when it was first offered, construction would be well underway with delivery scheduled to start next year. Now, as I say, it's still not too late while the Arafura supply chain remains in place. They're small warships. Each would be equipped with a 16-cell Mark 30 with 41 vertical launch missile system, anti-submarine warfare torpedoes. They could all be built and launched by Civmec at Henderson, living up finally to the promise of a continuous naval shipbuilding project. Now, another area, one of the few where things can be done quickly and very cheaply, are drones. The ADF has a space command, even though the only one actual space project, JP 9102, has been ingloriously cancelled. So let's actually do something useful and set up a tri-service drone command. And at the tactical end of the scale, Australia has plenty of companies able to produce both drones and anti-drone solutions. We should not import a single one of these. We might not be able to build an F-35, but combining the skills of companies such as SciPac, C2 Robotics, Anduril, Drone Shield and EOS, just to name a few, we could be a powerhouse of independent mass production of drones, and I emphasize mass production because that's what's going to be needed. Should there be another land war, the army will need thousands of these things every day. In other related areas, good progress is being made by Boeing on the MQ-28 Ghost Bat collaborative combat aircraft. This is, these are uncrewed systems that might have a payload of, 1,000 kilos and range. I think it's 3,700 miles that could accompany F-35s and Wedgetails and Super Hornet into combat, actually going ahead of them to detect threats, classify them. They could even carry a weapon if that's required. If there's any way of accelerating that project, even though it's going very quickly, I should be doing that. So let's stop fixating about second-hand nuclear-powered submarines that, in my opinion, will never be delivered, and instead throw our combined weight behind technologies that can be rapidly produced in Australia. Now, the hardest part of the equation, I think, is ramping up personnel numbers to operate new equipment, particularly since recruiting has gone backwards for a decade. And part of the problem that I've spoken about before seems to be the defence culture has changed into something secretive and suspicious of the outside world, and, fairly unpleasant, to be frank. Some people are nice. I mentioned the visit now a couple of weeks ago to Headquarters Joint Operations Command, and, we received some information there and were very well treated, but that is not the overall picture of the ADF, and I cannot stand this culture of ridiculous secrecy, the worst current case, of course, being C-3000 general-purpose frigates. And last week I bumped into Chief of the Army, Simon Stewart, at a function, the Japanese embassy as it happened, and I had a few words with him, and I asked how our promised interview about the destruction of the Taiwan helicopter fleet was coming along, and he said, rather sadly I thought, though I might have imagined that he wasn't the master of his own destiny in that regard. Think about that. In other words, a nasty little twerp in the office of Richard Marles can overrule our service chiefs about who they can speak with. And with this sort of pattern, is it any wonder that the ADF is not able to attract and retain the right sort of people? Now, here's some gratuitous advice for Simon Stewart, who I know and respect, by the way. He's one of the smarter, more decent people in the system. And my advice to Chief of Army is, once you have achieved everything that you want to do professionally, quit. Quit in protest, or at least threaten to do so. Say that this blanket of secrecy is un-Australian, incompatible with ADF values, and in fact encourages bad behaviour such as shooting prisoners in the back of the head, and it contributes also to grotesquely poor project management. And take it from me, when confronted with that threat, this government will cave in a millisecond. They have no collective spine. That's why, incidentally, I think the latest YouGov poll has the coalition in the lead by a couple of points. It's not that the government is horribly bad, I've seen worse. It's just that they appear to be weak and ineffectual. Defence is a case in point. Just tell Navy that they are getting missile corvettes and just to friggin' get on and do it. Stop complaining. Stop wasting time and money on these, fictitious long-term programs. Get stuff moving that is practical now. Now, a few words about Australian industry, and last week I also happened to be chatting with the CEO of one of the larger companies operating in Australia, and it was a private conversation, so I can't tell you who that was. But when we were discussing workload, this is a company that is shedding workers. I don't think it's yet dramatic numbers, but they are shrinking rather than expanding. And I think, anecdotally, I've heard the same is true across the sector. Now, if the really big companies are suffering, I'm pretty sure that the plight of SMEs is going to be even worse. And we have this complete schizophrenia where Ministers Miles and Conroy keep on insisting, against the available evidence, that the budget has never been better, that it's a record spend in Australia, that industry is booming. No, ministers, it is not booming. If we were to look at AUKUS Pillar 1 submarines, and I've had this now confirmed by several industry sources, that while money is being spent on infrastructure at HMAS Sterling, that's to prepare for the basing of the 4 Virginia-class submarines, not a single cent, not 1 cent has gone to any Australian company that is developing submarine-related technology. And at the same time, as I'm very fond of pointing out, because the more people who understand this, the better, we've just transferred the first $800 million, $800 million to the US Secretary of the Navy to lavish on US companies, while our own people get nothing, and that's the first payment of about $5 billion worth. It's just, I think, boggles the mind. Surely people can see that all of this talk about expanding the industrial bases of the 3 AUKUS countries so far has only been about expanding the industrial base of the United States, and to a lesser extent of the UK. There's nothing at all that's relevant to expanding Australian industry. And it's not as if we completely lack the talent. There are companies here that can write software. I mean, submarines are very big software-intensive systems. And by the way, if you can hear some funny noises in the background, that's my cat Brian. He just realizes that I'm talking, so he's trying to join in. Anyway, we have companies that can write software, but we also have some specialized manufacturers who can do pipes and valves and all of those sorts of things. I'll have to pause. It's the cat, pardon me. I'm sorry, we just had a few moments of chaos there as the feline wrecking ball also managed to knock over my laptop. But getting back to Australian industry. So yes, I think that the government should be much more active in pursuing opportunities with Australian companies. The combat system of the future AUKUS submarine, the one that the British might or might not build for us in the 2040s, that is meant to have a joint Australian UK-US combat system. Well, let's start work on that. Again, there are plenty of good Australian electronics companies there. Get them involved, but there's no sign of that whatsoever. Not only my clear impression, but that of a lot of people in industry is that the Australian Submarine Agency, frankly, doesn't know what it's doing. There's no real leadership there. There's no sense of purpose. There's no direction. And there's certainly nothing happening that benefits Australian companies. It's all going offshore. Okay, I've run out of time again for today. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.